very excited to host a panel on Turkey's presidential and parliamentary elections coming up on June 24th. So in June, Turkish citizens will elect their president, and there might be a runoff held 2 weeks after, on July 8th, if needed. And they will also elect members of the Turkish parliament in a single round of voting. Well, the elections, as many of you in this room might know, they were going to be originally held in 2019, but President Erdogan decided to call for snap elections, and many thought that this was a preemptive move by Erdogan to win ballots before potential economic difficulties. Of course, as in the past, election campaign is very much biased in favor of the government. They are being held under a state of emergency, and the media is very much controlled by the government, so the opposition candidates, they don't receive as much airtime. And you have the Kurdish candidate, he's leading his campaign from his prison cell. And also there was the recent decision to move some ballot boxes, especially in the Kurdish region. So there are just so many questions. And yet the opposition is excited and very much mobilized. So the question is, do they have a real shot at defeating Erdogan this time, after 16 years? Or will the recent currency crisis impact the election results? And what are the different election scenarios? So to discuss all these, we have a great panel of experts. We have Alan Makovsky to my left. He's a senior fellow for national security and international policy at Center for American Progress from 2001 to 2013. He served as a senior professional staff member on the Committee on Foreign Affairs in the House of Representatives. And there he covered the Middle East, Turkey, and other related issues. Also with us is Guney Yildiz. Guney is a researcher on Turkey, Syria, and the Kurds in the region. He's currently a visiting fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations, focusing mostly on dynamics of Kurdish politics in northern Syria and Iraqi Kurdistan. He also advised British politicians at the Foreign Affairs Select Committee of the UK Parliament as a special advisor on Turkey and the region. And finally, on Skype, we have Dr. Levent Koker. I hope you can hear us. He's a professor of political theory and public law. He's a visiting faculty at the Political Science Department of Northwestern University. In 2007, he was a member of a committee of scholars who prepared a draft new constitution opting for an ideal, typical parliamentary system in Turkey. So before I turn it over to our experts, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. We are recording this discussion, so please turn off your cell. You can hear me. So we're recording the discussion. Please turn off your cell phones, but we do encourage you to tweet using the hashtag MEITurkey. And also, I want to call your attention to our renovation campaign. We are renovating our traditional home right across on the corner on N Street to accommodate MEI's growing activities. So please pick up a pledge card at the front desk on your way out. So without further ado, I would like to start the discussion. And my question is to everyone on the panel. Well, when I talk to people in Turkey, on the one, I feel the excitement within the opposition and the fatigue among the AKP supporters. And the opposition is mobilized and it thinks that for the first time, it does have a real shot at defeating Erdogan. But they also voice skepticism. Given the high-stake nature of the elections and also the legislation that was passed by the government that's opening the door for electoral fraud. So some, and including some here, think that it's a foregone conclusion. and he will do a trick like he did in 2015 June elections when he lost the parliamentary majority. So the question is, my first question to all of you on the panel is that the case? Is it impossible to defeat him at the ballot box?
You're looking at me, so I guess I'll kick off. Well, first of all, let me say thank you, Gonul, to you and to MEI for inviting me and to be on such a distinguished panel and in front of so many, just among the people that I know, so many distinguished Turkey watchers, many of whom are probably far more qualified than I to be up here. But, and maybe I also can't help but add that I think this is sort of a life passage for me. I can't see Levent very well from my angle, but I did look up his bio. I think it's the first time for me when I've been on a four-person panel when I've been older than the collective age of the other three participants. But, all right, if I have to take a nap, you'll understand. Look, for many years, starting with what I think is generally considered the first free and fair election in Turkish history in 1950, from then until 2017 with the referendum, I don't think that a loser of a national election in Turkey ever said, I lost because I got cheated. That's a great record. Even there was a referendum in 1987 where the difference was less than 1%, and the government was on the losing side. I mean, nobody questioned the result. It was really, I mean, whatever other defects there were in Turkish democracy, that was a proud boast. And now I think that proud boast is no longer there. Mm-hmm. There was the issue of the unstamped ballots. So, look, is it impossible to defeat him? You know, there's, looking at the polls, even in a free and fair vote, it looks like it would be very tough to defeat him, but possible. But given what happened in 2017, given the new election law that was just passed in March, which actually legitimizes some of the questionable practices that were done in 2017 regarding counting unstamped ballots, which previously was against the law. Given what they are already doing, consolidating certain polling places in the southeast, which will diminish the ability of Kurds to vote, I think it's going to be, it's a very, very long shot. Now, if it's a free and fair election, perhaps. I'll just say one thing on the last point. The Kurdish vote is particularly crucial in this election. Some of you may remember in June and November of 2015, it was also important. In order to get into the parliament, as an individual party, you must get a 10% vote nationally. HDP, which I'll call shorthand the Kurdish party, it's Kurdish, it's primarily a Kurdish party. It's also a liberal party that draws some non-Kurdish votes. According to all the polls, is on the cusp. According to all the polls, if they get the 10%, and add that with what the other opposition parties are likely to get, there is no way that AK Party, Erdogan's party, will get a majority in parliament. That's separate from the presidential race, but in parliament. Matter of fact, all of their votes will probably go to Erdogan's party because if you don't meet the 10% threshold, the party that comes in second for the seats that you win get all your votes. So, and Erdogan's party is likely to come in second in the Kurdish area. So that is a very critical vote this time around. So when you read about efforts to diminish the Kurdish vote, that's what it's all about. It's about the Kurdish party, HDP, making the 10% or not. I could go on.
Yeah, and then the possibility of an electoral fraud is strongest in the Kurdish region.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I'll just add that it's of the 600 parliamentary seats that are being contested, roughly 80, 79, I think it's the number, are in Kurdish dominated, are in provinces where there are significant majority or near majority Kurdish population.
And there was a recent decision to move, according to the decision, around 150,000 Kurdish voters will be unable to vote in their traditional polling stations.
Right.
So, Guney, so what is your take?
I think first, let me thank you as well, Gonul, for your invitation and to MEI as well. But you know, I think this question requires an answer on two different levels. One is, you know, whether it's possible to beat President Erdogan in the ballot boxes in these conditions, like calling for a snap election, almost like an ambush against the opposition. Also, these vote rigging concerns, President Erdogan's domination of the media, like almost 95% of the media, and his institutional control, like civil servants basically working for the ruling party in many areas, and also the brand recognition aspect of some of the candidates in the opposition. So whether it will be possible despite these conditions. And the second level, I think that requires us, even if you know, a possible victory for the opposition, would that mean that an opposition can run a country which has been run by AK Party for the last 16 years, which established control over several institutions, several key institutions, appointing kind of loyalists to these departments? Would it be possible for them to kind of run a country which is institutionally may still be controlled by the AK Party? On the first level, I think the vote rigging issue, those concerns, you would find it interesting that vote rigging is quite a serious accusation. And according to one opinion poll, a Gezici opinion poll, just to be precise, 70% of Turkish people believe that the previous referendum on constitutional change, well, the vote was rigged in that referendum. 70%, which is interesting because it includes voters of the AK Party as well. You would expect a government which is facing these kind of accusations to try to put cold water on those accusations by trying to prove that elections will take place in perfectly fair and conditions. But we don't necessarily see such comments from the government. So it is almost like the case that government is not very much worried about people having concerns about vote rigging. I think that will have an effect on opposition voters. It will have a kind of disempowering effect on opposition voters and have an empowering effect on the voters for President Erdogan. So if people believe that it is a foregone conclusion, they would find it difficult to turn up for.
That's why maybe the opposition doesn't really bring up that much, not to discourage.
Exactly, but vote rigging is also a huge organization. Like it requires a huge organization and full participation of most state institutions, including the security, other administrative bodies, and there were some irregularities in Kurdish region in the previous referendum, but it wasn't. There hasn't been a full concrete evidence of vote rigging, and also another region, other regions that could be watched. Are not the Kurdish majority areas, but AK Party supporters, main AK Party supporting areas. So, for example, in, let's say, central Anatolian town, which supports AK Party like around 60%, you can, it might be possible where the opposition will not have election monitors, most probably in these kind of areas. So that's another area to watch. But I think this,
And they're actually limited now by law. They aren't allowed to have the same number of monitors
yes,
they
exactly.
had in past elections.
Exactly. But I think this, vote rigging concerns and this discussion should be made very seriously. Like if should be also only brought in when there's concrete evidence, and. I would like to leave that debate there, but about the institutional control, whether it will be possible, whether AK Party, if they are defeated, will they leave?
Well, actually, Guney, I'll get back to that point when we talk about different scenarios. So if you don't mind, let's leave it there, and I want to turn to Levent Bey. Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay,
I
so
heard.
what is your take on the question of whether it's possible to beat President Erdogan at the ballot box, given the concerns over electoral fraud?
First of all, thank you very much, and my greetings from all of you in Washington, D.C. I have to say, first of all, that this election, these elections in 2024 and subsequently following runoff in early July is not being carried out in the free election conditions. There's a state of emergency, and there are more speakers, and you also mentioned that some legislation has been passed. So the electoral process is open to fraud, but let's forget all about it and let's assume if some minimal conditions.
Sorry, I think we can't hear you very well.
Okay, let's assume for a moment that these elections are going to be free and fair, or at least there won't be an electoral fraud. Okay, then departing from several public opinion polls that have been carried out recently, it is quite likely that in the parliamentary elections, we will have a parliament with an oppositional majority. And there will be a presidential runoff election in July 8th. So one possibility is an opposition-dominated parliament will work with President Erdogan after a runoff election if he wins. So this possibility is opposition-dominated parliament with Erdogan, and Erdogan will not like this. So we have to guess what will happen at that instance. But on the other hand, the possibility is that there will be a opposition-dominated parliament, and in that case, in the runoff election on July 8th, Erdogan's rival might win the runoff because the parliament is lost by the AKP and HT alliance.
Well,
so
we can actually, we'll come back to that point when we talk about different election scenarios. But what do you think about the electoral fraud?
Well, it is very difficult to, first of all, everything, I mean, if we want to talk about the possibility of defeating AKP and Erdogan's powerful presidency, it is a must that People's Democratic Party, HDP, must pass the threshold. So not only the Kurdish voters, but also the opposition electorate or constituencies of opposition parties, not only CHP, but Saadet and Felicity Party and İYİ Party, they also, I think, are quite aware of the fact that if HDP cannot pass the threshold, they will also lose everything. So the Kurdish regional vote is of crucial importance, and there might be some fraud regarding those regions. There's a problem of carrying ballot boxes to distant areas or areas where it is dominated by AKP voters. So villagers might have hard time in going there, or if they go there, they might be having hard time voting for HDP, etc. This is something you also mentioned, some 150,000 voters approximately, maybe more, nearly 300,000 Kurdish voters might be affected by this state of affairs. But on the other hand, in metropolitan areas like Istanbul, Ankara, Izmir, Adana, in big cities, and in towns in Turkey's western provinces, people who will not vote for HDP normally may vote for HDP just for the reason to make the HDP pass the threshold. This is something to pay attention. So fraud in counting votes, etc., is very different in this case.
We cannot hear you. So maybe I can turn to Ellen, and in the meantime you can pick up your headphones. Okay. So speaking, well, I guess he's saying that the opposition has to really mobilize, and they have. There are several platforms to monitor the elections, and people, of course, are aware of the fact that electoral fraud is a strong possibility, so they're mobilized. And I want to, but in general, what do you think about the opposition's performance? You know, especially the main opposition party, CHP, has been considered a very ineffective opposition, and yet this time it looks like they're doing and saying all the right things. What do you think?
Yeah, it's been impressive. It's been far impressive, more impressive than past performances. First of all, choosing Muharrem İnce as their candidate, which there are different stories about how that happened. It was kind of a last-minute decision, but it's an interesting one in that he is somebody who has, on 2 occasions, significantly challenged the leader of his own party, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, for leadership of that party, and now the leader has turned to him to be the presidential candidate.
Which is in itself a challenging narrative to Erdogan,
yes,
who sent his generals to a potential challenger, Abdullah Gül, to prevent him from running. So that in itself was a strong message, I think, to people.
Right. And the Abdullah Gül near candidacy is an interesting side story, but based on polls, I'm really not convinced that Gül would have been as strong a challenger to Erdogan as İnce. Our auctioneer, whichever one gets into the second round, can be. İnce, as you said, he has an interesting narrative. He has a blue-collar background. He went to Quran courses as a kid, which was even something in his era of somewhat questionable legality. But he comes from a religious family. He knows how to pray. I mean, coming from a party that Erdogan likes to label as atheist. He is a combative speaker. He's shown the common touch. He drove a tractor. He did different things that are not associated with CHP over the years, which has been often painted as an elitist and, as I say, godless party. The polls right now, look, at least the one that I follow the most closely, and I think it's representative, the one I follow most closely is Metropol. There are a bunch of polls out there, but they don't differ that much. The most recent Metropol, which was done based on mid-May samplings, had him in a second round losing 47 to 37. I'm sorry, 47 to 37 with, in addition, undecideds. So that's fairly close. He is running ahead of his party by a few percentage points in the parliamentary election. One thing I do want to, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
I just wonder how many people realize that because of the referendum last year, there's a new system in Turkey. Until now, Turkey has always had a parliamentary government, and they've operated more or less like other parliamentary governments around the world. A parliament's elected, and the prime minister or a ruling coalition would come from that parliamentary vote. Now they have moved to 2 separate votes, 2 separate simultaneous votes. So on one part of the ballot, there is the presidential race, where Erdogan is running against Muharrem İnce and Meral Akşener and some minor candidates. And on the other side of the ballot is the parliamentary vote. And the president is going to be the dominant player in this system. And I would say if the president's party wins a majority in parliament, you could have something pretty close to one-man rule in Turkey. But if the president's party does not win the majority, you can have, Parliament might be able, I say might because, look, there's a lot of factors, emergency rule, the fact that the president is going to have a lot of control over the judiciary that could skew things. But as the rules of the game are written on paper, Parliament can do a lot to make life very difficult for the president. And so anyway, I just wanted to quickly explain that.
Okay, that's good. And I have another question for you, but let me first ask Guney about the Kurdish opposition. The HDP is polling somewhere around 10, 11%, but given everything that's going on, including the state of emergency, how likely are they to pass the 10% threshold, do you think?
I think we can't rule out the possibility of the HDP being below the threshold, and that is the most ideal scenario for President Erdogan, because that would mean his AK Party will have the parliamentary majority, and he will, even if the election is presidential election is on the second round, it will still mean that the public support for him is unlikely to shift away from him if he has the parliamentary majority due to HDP being below the threshold. I believe the previous rise of HDP was mainly due to the conflict in Syrian Kurdish town of Kobani. Rather than the HDP's own efforts, and the Turkish presidents.
You mean in 2015,
in
June elections, when they captured 13%.
13%.
So it wasn't about the HDP leaders' narrative saying that they challenging Erdogan in the presidentialism, but it was mostly about Kobani.
I believe that my understanding is that it was mostly about Kobani. It was the Turkish presidents kind of managing the crisis in Kobani in terms of like public. President Erdogan wasn't very good in kind of appealing to Kurdish kind of sentiments during the Kobani siege, and that caused many former AK Party supporter Kurds switch away from AK Party. And at the moment we have a similar situation in Afrin. And I think Afrin might have, Afrin is a Syrian Kurdish town which was captured from the Kurdish People's Protection Units by Turkish Army, and Turkish Army controlled Free Syrian Army groups. This was a big issue in Turkish TV channels, and I think the message that has been given to Turkish public, that perceived by Turkish public, was different from Kurdish public in this sense. It apparently didn't create enough of a hype in nationalism in Turkey, but I think it might have created a kind of a strong backlash among Kurds, like AK Party supporters or others.
Yeah, no, my next question was going to be, what about the non-HDP voters, the Kurds, conservative Kurds who have supported the AKP? Do you think they are alienated enough? And where would they go? I mean, would they vote for the HDP, or is there any other, for instance, the Islamist Felicity Party? Could they vote for them, or will some Kurds decide to remain?
I mean, from President Erdogan's perspective, any Kurd who is not supporting AK Party is a loss. Like, even if they support, if in a situation where HDP passes the election threshold, AK Party will likely to lose a parliamentary majority. And if in the presidential election people vote either for, not for President Erdogan, that will be a loss, and they can either choose the CHP candidate in the second round, or in the first round they can either vote for Selahattin Demirtas, the HDP leader. So in that sense, the Kurds are kind of spoiled for choice for the first time in Turkish elections, I think, in recent Turkish elections, because it used to be the case that it was only AK Party that managed to try to appeal to Kurds, as well as Turkish right-wing in the previous elections. But for the first time, we are seeing the CHP candidate is also using a discourse that tries to appeal to Kurds. He visited Selahattin Demirtas, the HDP leader, spoke favorably of him, which is quite a shift in Turkish politics. We also saw, as you mentioned, the Felicity Party leader, who is like the mother, let's say the parent movement that AK Party was born out of, also speaking favorably for the Kurds. And in terms of the HDP, I mean, the Turkish politics is not only electoral politics. The organized communities matter a lot as well. For example, when the ultra-nationalist Action Party, which is now an ally of President Erdogan, couldn't secure any seats in the parliament in 2002. It was still a very important movement because they had mobilized, youth movement and mobilizable youth movement, and they had control over Turkish security. They had influence over Turkish police, for example. So these things matter as well. And in terms of the Kurdish opposition, this is one of the most organized communities in Turkey, and they are actually mobilized by the broader Kurdish movement, not just by the HDP. HDP is actually driving its support from an already mobilized Kurdish masses, which is organized by legal or illegal Kurdish movement. So that's HDP's base. But what HDP is not doing is they're not trying to tap into Kurdish nationalism, potential Kurdish nationalism, which could be derived out of people's resentment of the Afrin operation in Syria.
What do you mean, in their messaging?
In their messaging, in their discourse. HDP very much targets broader Turkey, rather than focusing on Kurdish nationalism, believing that Kurdish.
I believe not to alienate the Western voters.
Yes,
right.
Yes, but whether this will be enough to keep Kurdish support, Kurdish nationalist support, because as you mentioned, there are also AK Party supporting conservative Kurds who would shift away from AK Party only when their Kurdish nationalist sentiments becomes stronger. So. But what Alan mentioned, I think what Mr. Koker mentioned, Levent mentioned, that some Turkish voters, constituents of CHP, might even switch to voting for HDP, because actually HDP is going below the threshold. Is not like the end of the world for the Kurds. Broadly, because they are an organized community, and HDP MPs in the parliament didn't make a huge difference for the Kurds, because AK Party already has majority when it comes to the Kurdish issue. Like they can even ally with the İYİ Party, the Meral Akşener's, like one of the opposition parties. CHP is usually allied with AK Party when it comes to the Kurdish issue. So Kurds already face a majority, whatever happens. But if the HDP is below the threshold, it will be worse for the broader Turkish opposition.
Well, Levent Bey, I have a question about Meral Akşener. She's the candidate of İYİ Party who broke with the nationalist MHP. She is arguing that her chances of beating Erdogan in a second round are stronger because she can draw votes away from the AKP's religious conservative base. And she argues that the CHP's candidate cannot. What do you think? Could she be a better second round candidate?
Judging from the recent public opinion polls, it seems quite unlikely that Meral Akşener will participate in the runoff election. It is probably most likely that Muharrem İnce is going to be the candidate that will take part in runoff. So my personal opinion is in the same direction as well. So I don't think that Meral Akşener will be able to participate in the runoff elections.
Do you think the CHP's candidate can appeal to the religious conservatives? Because that's a must if he wants to have
on one condition, if there happens no fraud in parliamentary votes, then it seems very likely that the parliamentary majority will be controlled by the opposition, including the HDP. So if the parliament is going to be controlled by the opposition after 24 June, then in the runoff elections that will take place 2 weeks later on July 8th, the voters might shift from supporting Erdogan to Muharrem İnce.
Well, that was going to be my next question, and I want to talk about different scenarios here. Let's assume that Erdogan wins the presidency and the AKP loses the parliament.
Yes.
So in that scenario, can the parliament play a meaningful role in terms of counterbalancing Erdogan? What does the new constitution say?
May I answer this question?
Sure.
Well, as everybody knows, we had some constitutional amendments made in April 2017, and according to those amendments, in many areas of legislation, the president will have the power to rule by decree. And he also is going to have a veto power against the parliamentary legislation. So presidential decrees can only be overturned by the parliament by a legislative act. And if that act is vetoed by the president, then that veto can be overridden by an absolute majority in parliament, which means at least 301 seats in parliament must be under the control of the opposition. So the president will have difficulties with working with a parliamentary parliament controlled by an oppositional majority. In that case, some advisors to the president today are speaking about the possibility of renewing all the elections, including presidential and parliamentary elections again. But it won't be very easy to renew presidential and parliamentary elections for other reasons. But I don't have time to go into that,
well,
I think.
Recently, Bloomberg interviewed Erdogan, and he said that the whole point of presidential system is to have a parliamentary majority, and that he would not tolerate a hung parliament, which indicated to me that he would call for snap elections again if he loses the parliamentary majority. Is that possible? And
I don't think it's possible. One reason for this is, and I don't think it is open to various different forms of constitutional interpretation. The new constitution is very clear. The president is going to be elected by direct popular vote, and one person cannot be elected more than twice. So if Erdogan is going to be elected president on either 24 June or 8 July, he won't be able to run in an election that will be renewed for a presidential new term. That's for sure. On only one condition: if a new snap election decision is going to be made by the parliament, then Erdogan can run for a third time. But if Erdogan makes that decision to renew parliamentary elections, this means that from a constitutional point of view, the new constitution foresees that parliamentary elections must be held simultaneously in the same day with the presidential elections. So a decision to renew parliamentary elections means presidential elections will be renewed also. And if this decision is made by Erdogan himself, he won't be able to run for the third time. So he won't be able to make that decision because he won't be able to run for the third time. Then the parliament has to make that decision to renew the elections. But parliament, in that case, controlled by the opposition, will not make that kind of a decision to renew the elections. So a renewal is not possible.
Okay, Alan, you have something to
Yeah, I
add?
just wanted to pick up on a couple of points. Yes, I completely agree. It's very clear in the new system. It says the president can only be elected twice. If Parliament, and you need 60% of Parliament to call new elections. Under the old system, it was just 50% plus one, but now it's 60%. Would call new elections during his second term, he can get a third term. Now, one thing, if Erdogan does get elected this time, we know this will be his second term. But I understand from people who work with him, that work for him, that their interpretation is that this is in effect a new system. So it would give him 2 more terms and then a potential for a third. I suppose at some point down the line, maybe the opposition will contest that interpretation. So far it hasn't. I just want to say also on what the parliament can do. According to the new rules, yes, the president can issue decrees, and that goes very, very far. But those decrees are limited in certain ways. First of all, the parliament is empowered to overturn any presidential decree. Second of all, he is not supposed to issue a decree in an area where parliament has already made law. Third of all, he is not allowed to issue decrees regarding basic human rights that are guaranteed in the Turkish constitution. I understand some people may say those guarantees are honored more in the breach than in reality, but, and lastly, there are several places in the Constitution where the word kanun, law, is used. That it says a law, that for example, declaring war or allowing foreign troops to use Turkish territory or sending Turkish troops abroad, or even more mundane things about privacy protections. Many, many times the word kanun, law, appears. Any time that word appears, according to the rules, the president is not allowed to make a decree in that area. So there really are that it's for parliament only. Kanun is only for parliament. So I'm just saying I understand he's going to appoint 12 of the 15 constitutional court judges who maybe will justify anything he does. And there's emergency rule, although if he loses control of parliament, parliament can end emergency rule. There's a lot of things he can pull, but according to the rules, parliament can make a lot of trouble. An opposition-controlled parliament can make a lot of trouble for Erdogan or any president.
I want to talk about the different scenario. What if the opposition wins? You touched on it initially. I recently made the argument that an opposition victory might turn into a double-edged sword, given the looming economic crisis. People will forget that this was all Erdogan's doing and blame the opposition for not fixing the economic troubles. But you also talked about the institutional structure there too. So what do you think? What would that mean for the opposition, for the country, an opposition win of the presidency?
Yes, there's this aspect of like economy not going well, and it might be blamed on opposition even if that somewhat unlikely scenario happens. But I think we can look at this by bringing in some conceptual kind of different conceptual framework. How I see what's happening in Turkish history is that the republic that was established by Kemal Atatürk in 1923 had a secularist, nationalist, pro-Western outlook, and this republic was in power ideologically between 1925 to 2010, when AK Party got a strong control, until when AK Party, with their allies, got a strong hold of the Turkish state establishment. And the Second Republic, what I call the Turkish Islamic Synthesis Republic, which was formulated in 1980, the coup d'etat, came to power firmly in 2010, which was formulated in 1980, came to power in 2010, when, as I said, AK Party took control. So it is the first time that the First Republic has updated itself in a way that it tries to, in the discourse of...
Sorry, 2000, just to clarify, 2010, the restructuring of the judiciary.
Judiciary, that was the most important thing, because the Kemalist establishment was based on 4 main pillars: the judiciary, military, parliament, and presidency. So if opposition power gets majority in a parliament, then you have 3 other legs to prevent them from, from controlling the state. But AK Party successfully managed to take control of most of these institutions, and in 2010. And the First Republic, as I said, it's the first time that they're reacting with a fighting back with an updated version of their ideology. In a way, they want to appeal to both conservatives and the Kurds. So, that's a new thing, and that could have an effect on the reversing the hegemonic shift in Turkish establishment. And when the Second Republic, led by President Erdogan at the moment, came to control the state, they came up with a huge state transformation. So Turkish state, where in Kemalist establishment the core of the power was not, you couldn't point to who has the most power in Turkey, in the Kemalist country, because it was somewhere between judiciary, military, parliament, and other institutions. But in President Erdogan's model, it is firmly centered around presidency.
So it's a personalization of power has never been...
It had never been the case. Almost even in Kemal Atatürk's time when he was president. But Erdogan, that's not the whole scenario. So the economy is also centralized. There are attempts to centralize the economic power with construction companies that are close to the government, who also takes defense industry tenders, and also strong in energy industry. So they are all kind of linked to the presidency. So presidency is at the core. The second layer is centralization of the security establishment and state establishment around Turkish intelligence, which was reformed in a way to have links to provide cohesion between different state institutions. So there's another layer of centralization. And the security establishment is also changing a lot. So Turkey used to be a country where military had an absolute kind of say on security issues. At the moment, we have special forces in police and in gendarmerie, also in the military, whose number went up almost 250% since 2016, and the recruitment criteria for these people are mostly based on loyalty to the AK Party rather than loyalty solely to the state. So these things have had a huge effect on kind of the state and Erdogan relations. What I argue is that state is still separate from President Erdogan. We cannot equate President Erdogan with the whole state establishment, and there are still pockets of state, especially in the military, that are not necessarily pro-Erdoganist. And but President Erdogan had a huge use value, if I can use the term, for broader Turkish public and the state, especially in his first term, when he was a pro-Western politician who was appealing to the Middle East without alienating the West, also provided safe pair of hands for the economy, and also appealed to the Kurds in a peaceful way, reintegrating them with the system. This has all changed in his second term, when he didn't have as good relations with the West. He had to deal with Russia. He was pragmatic enough to do that. And his foreign policy kind of shifted from being a multi-directional foreign policy into more Islamist leanings, and now back to firmly being nationalist. So President Erdogan's use value changed in his second term, where also he lost his appeal to the Kurds, peaceful appeal to the Kurds. But he then securitizes that understanding of the Kurdish question and kind of tapped into some other sections of the state, which favors a military solution to the Kurdish issue. But in his current situation, President Erdogan is not providing a safe pair of hands for the economy. Actually, the economy, many people blame him personally for for economy getting from bad to worse. Also, the military kind of securitization of the Kurdish issue is not providing the results that are full results. And rapprochement with Russia, the state believes, many different factions within the state would believe that Turkey received as much as it can by becoming closer to Russia. So now, in order to consolidate these things, the pendulum needs to swing back to West. So in all these issues, President Erdogan's use value for the state and for the Turkish public, which also favors, thinks the economy is one of the most important issues, almost like 70%, do not necessarily think President Erdogan is the best person to do that, which has been the case throughout the 16 years of power. So all these things would mean that, if the opposition wins, there will be a strong momentum from within the state, from within the public, to switch back to a different candidate.
Well, you raised interesting points. I have questions, but I'll stop. But just one more question to Levent Bey, and then I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. So the third scenario is if Erdogan wins everything. Is that the final nail in the coffin of Turkish democracy, or is there some reason for hope?
Well, yes and no. Yes, because if Erdogan wins the presidency and the parliament is controlled by AKP and MHP alliance, then Erdogan will take all. So according to the amendment passed in April 2017, the executive will have legislative powers, will have a good deal amount of power to control the judiciary and the parliament as well. So it will be a kind of an autocratic single man rule. I wouldn't call it a dictatorship because of conceptual reasons, because dictatorship might be temporary or they might be permanent, but we might also invoke from a constitutional conceptual point of view what Carl Schmitt, the Nazi period German constitutional scholar, called a sovereign dictatorship. If Erdogan gets all, then Turkey will end up with a sovereign dictatorship. But no, because the parliament, if it is going to be controlled by the AKP and MHP alliance, you know, these alliances are among political parties. And after the elections, all political parties will be represented in the parliament individually. So if AKP and MHP and BBP alliance wins a majority in parliament, this does not mean that they will behave homogeneously to support Erdogan. This, we don't know if this is going to be sustainable or not. The same holds true for the other side of the alliance. The opposition is also an alliance with the exception of HDP. So depending on how the parties in the alliances will behave after the elections, the parliament might become an active check and balance mechanism against Erdogan's presidential power or not. If parliament doesn't work as a checking and balancing institution, then we'll end up with a sovereign dictatorship. If parliament starts acting in a politically checking and balancing manner vis-a-vis the president's powers, then we might hope for a parliamentary or democratic form of restoration in Turkish Republic. But all these possibilities depend on HDP's performance in the elections, plus how the opposition and power, the AKP-MHP alliance and opposition alliance will treat the HDP. Remember the results of the June 7, 2015 elections. All parties, AKP, MHP, and others, all political groups in Turkey, treated HDP, which was the third major party in the parliament with 80 seats, they treated HDP as if they don't exist. So if this continues, which means that a grave negligence of the priorities of Kurdish political demands will end up with a non-solution of Turkey's most fundamental problems of political pluralism. So everything depends on whether Turkey will deal with its Kurdish issue in a democratic manner or not. If the opposition chooses to deal with the Kurdish issue in the classical manner the Turkish state has treated the Kurdish issue from the start, then there won't be much hope for a return to a normal democracy in Turkey. So this is the fundamental issues Turkey is facing. But from a strategic political perspective, Erdogan might be checked and balanced even if his alliance wins the parliamentary majority. That's a possibility, but not very likely.
Well, the point that you raised about how permanent the AKP-MHP alliance will be is a very important one. And now I would like to turn to the audience for questions. Please wait for, we have mics, right? So please wait for the mic and try to be brief in your questions. Okay, let's take 3. Okay, there's one. Okay, Andrew and, okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My name is Galilin Enstrass. I'm from the INSS. I wanted to ask about the alliance system. Where did this idea come from? How will it affect the recent elections? And will it change in the future the problematic attitude in the Turkish public opinion to coalitions?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And there's another question here.
Thank you. My question's on a similar note on the AKP-MHP alliance. Some observers speculated that Turkish aggression in the region was a way of energizing nationalist support or cultivating it before the election. So my question is, in the event of Erdogan's victory, does the rhetoric subside? Does the aggression in the region subside? And on the same note, does the presence of MHP in the parliament, or an increased presence, what does that mean for Turkish geopolitics? Thank you.
Okay. Another question, Umar?
I have a question for Alan about Turkish-American relations. In the likely scenario of an Erdogan victory, how do you see the evolution of things with the Trump White House? And in the unlikely scenario of a CHP victory, what is CHP's foreign policy, and specifically with the United States?
Okay, Levent Bey, did you hear the questions? Could you be able to hear the questions?
Partly, there was one question about AKP-MHP alliance.
Yes, so there was, the first question was on the electoral alliance between AKP and MHP and how the party made that decision and how that would affect Turkish political culture about coalitions. So if you would like to take that question, then we can move to the other panelists for other questions.
When prior to constitutional amendment favoring a Turkish form of an autocratic presidential system last year, Erdogan's and AKP's main argument was that coalitions are bad for stability and fast-acting executive branch of government. So to avoid coalitions destabilizing Turkish politics and the state, we have to have a permanent, fast-acting executive, which is a single person that would have the executive powers in his hand. So this process of the formation of alliances this time proves that the thesis that supported or used by the AKP to support what they call the presidential system, Alaturka, is void, because we already have coalitions and we already have chances of what they would call destabilizing Turkish policy. So I hope the results of the elections will be a chance to reconsider what it means to run a country in a democratic way. We shall not be afraid of coalitions, alliances, negotiations, pluralism in all aspects. So this is another instance in which Turkey experiences political pluralism in a very grave manner. This happened in 1970s, and the late Bülent Ecevit at that time clearly stressed that we shall not be afraid of forming coalition government. But at that time, he was criticized severely. But now I think we know that he is right. We have to learn to form coalitions for stability. stability does not mean a strong-handed single person running the country with absolute power. This is not stability, and we have been experiencing this for decades now. So I think AKP-MHP coalition or alliance will show future signs how this alliance may have political impact on the country.
Okay, thank you. Ellen, you want to address the second the question on Turkey-U.S. relations?
Sure. Well, whoever is elected is going to have to deal with the legacy of the Erdogan era, whether it's Erdogan himself or one of the other two major candidates. The two main issues, which I think are boiling right now, both in the executive branch and in Congress, where there's been a number of pieces of legislation, are the arrest of the pastor Andrew Brunson, an evangelical who happens to belong to the same church as as Secretary of State Pompeo, and the Turkish purchase of S-400 anti-aircraft equipment from Russia, which has been, the deal has been signed, but it's not been delivered yet. Look, I think in the aftermath of the election, temperatures are likely to cool. Now, it's easier to answer for CHP, for a Muharrem Ince wins, let's say, or auctioneer. CHP is tied to the West by its very secular nature, and it needs support from the West. I would imagine that the S-400 deal would somehow be set aside fairly quickly. Releasing Brunson, which, even though most people see it as hostage diplomacy, has been formally done within the construct of a judicial system, might be a little more complicated, but I think both of those things would happen fairly quickly. I think Erdogan also will probably want to find some way to avoid the sanctions, which will almost inevitably happen under the S-400, with an S-400 purchase. So I think he would try to work his way out of that. The YPG issue, which is called the U.S. partnership with the YPG, which Turkey sees as equivalent to the PKK. Our partnership with them in Syria, I think, is something which is going to remain a neuralgic issue no matter who is elected. I'll just say on the S-400, or in general, a wild card is Erdogan is very tough to predict. So I think he will have, after the election, assuming he wins and gets a parliamentary majority, every reason to back off of his confrontation with the United States, which has been very politically useful for him. The polls in Turkey show the United States wildly unpopular. And Russia, as a matter of fact, sadly, although also unpopular, much less unpopular than the United States. I think that, so it's a little bit unclear how Erdogan will do with it. I think he'll have a reason to back off. Trump is a wild card. Because I would say within, I know he's always a wild card, but I mean something a little more specific than that regarding Turkey. This is very impressionistic, but it's an impression I think that's widely shared. Within the bureaucracy, at most levels, Erdogan in the United States, State Department, Treasury, Commerce, okay, DOD. Erdogan is very unpopular. I don't think there's any question. He's among one of the most disliked world leaders. But Trump has never said anything bad about him. Erdogan has actually, for a while, never said anything personal about Trump, but Jerusalem changed that. And Erdogan now has attacked Trump, but Trump doesn't answer. And Trump has only said positive things about Erdogan to this point. So where in the end he would come down, for example, this will be my last point on this, if the S-400 sale does go through, which would automatically invoke congressional sanctions, but waivable sanctions, I don't think we could exclude that Trump would waive those sanctions.
So you're not optimistic about the roadmap agreed between the two, between
I'm a little
Pompeo and
skeptical about the roadmap, maybe because I worked on the Middle East peace process too long, where they also had roadmaps that never got to the destination. But look, Turkey is describing this roadmap as a major breakthrough. But if you notice, the State Department spokesman says it's a general roadmap, conditions-based. So we'll see.
And Guney, the question on Andrew's question on how the MHP-AKP alliance, how will that affect the Turkish regional policy?
Yeah, I think Andrew asked about whether the aggression will subsume. It's difficult to be confident about Turkish foreign policy, which meandered between like different kind of approaches. But I think I can be confident enough to say aggression will not subsume and subside. I think, if you look at how we get this to this position, like Turkey used to be a reluctant regional actor under, Kemalist establishment, which kind of delegated foreign policy mostly to the West. And then under AK Party, initially we had multi-directional foreign policy in the Middle East, zero problems with neighbors policy, in other terms. And then this policy became more like an Islamist leaning, with Islamist leanings with the start of the Arab Spring. And especially when the Arab Spring reached to Syria and problems in Iraq, made Turkish foreign policy more like a sectarian Sunni-oriented foreign policy. Well, with the rise of the Kurds, most of these kind of reflexes changed, and Turkish foreign policy became like a proactive anti-Kurdish Turkish nationalist foreign policy. And actually, President Erdogan, people around him, people inside the Turkish state, believe that this kind of approach is actually getting results. The Kurdish issue is Turkey's Achilles heel in most respects. But President Erdogan is very good in trying to turn the weakest points, the disadvantages into advantages. So by legitimizing Turkish actions on perceived security threats in different regions, Turkey is able to have some presence inside Syria for the first time. Both in Kurdish regions and other regions, this has been Turkish incursions into these areas. Both are supported, receiving public support from the West as well as from Russia. And Turkish foreign policy is also based on trying to exploit geopolitical rivalries between Moscow and Washington. So as long as these geopolitical rivalry is like tense in places like Syria and other places, Turkey is able to play into this. And also the state transformation, the strengthening of the defense industry in Turkey suggests that that is a military, what they call military diplomacy. If you speak to, for example, presidential officials or prime ministry officials, they would, one of the phrases you would hear is that they would say, if you're not present on the ground militarily, you won't be present in a negotiating table. They have been saying this for the last several years. They, when the shooting down of the Russian fighter jet happened, which backfired, that Turkey realized Turkey cannot challenge Russia in the Middle East. And it continued with Jarablus operation in northern Syria. So everything is kind of geared up to continuing such aggression, and it also allows Turkey to have working strong cooperation both with Russia and Iran, which is taking place at the moment in Iraqi Kurdistan, with Turkey's military operation against the PKK in that region. With Iranian intelligence support, with Iranian political support. So combined pressure of Iran and Turkey on Kurdish administration also in Iraqi Kurdistan helps Turkey to go deeper than ever possible. And so aggression, I think we can be confident that this aggression will continue.
Just another, speaking of new defense concepts, Erdogan has been talking about preemptively targeting Turkey's enemies. And the government has been signaling an operation against the PKK in Kandil in northern Iraq. I think that's now, it's paving the way, and I think it only makes sense for him to launch the operation before the elections. Do you see that happening anytime soon?
The operation against the PKK in Iraqi Kurdistan has been actually ongoing for the last 2 months.
Since March.
Yeah, 2 months almost, but it hasn't been very visible in Turkish press. One of the reasons was that the results of this operation wasn't as good as President Erdogan wanted to see. But a few weeks before the election, they think, I mean, it's plausible to think that the AK Party thinks bringing up this issue will help channeling the nationalist voters towards AK Party, because also according to some polls, the Afrin, capturing Afrin didn't create enough of a hype in nationalism in Turkey, apparently. So an attack against the Kandil region could be used in that way. But Kandil is a very different kind of terrain compared to Afrin. And Iran is helping Turkey also because in order to eliminate a potential Kurdish insurgency inside Iran, which has been some Western politicians talk about, by having Turkey trying to crush the Kurdish groups in that region, so solving Iran's problem preemptively also here. But also the second reason why Iran is supporting Turkey is that Kandil will be a very difficult region for Turkey, and it will also have the possibility to bog down Turkey in a really difficult conflict, which will keep Turkey busy for maybe months or years, and will keep Turkey very much dependent on Iran for support in that region. So Turkey will need Russian support in Afrin and Iranian support in Kandil.
Okay, questions? The gentleman here, another there, and here.
Herb Rose. Starting about a year and a half ago,
So can you identify yourself?
Starting about a year and a half ago, when it was first announced that Turkey was going to buy S-400s from Russia, most of the people I talked to and people sitting in similar positions as you are now didn't seem to make too much of it. For me, I was like Pavlov's dog. Every time I heard S-400, my eyebrows would raise, and I thought, how could a member of NATO purchase Russian-made rockets? Now you mentioned that Congress is taking some umbrage at that and might propose sanctions. I'm wondering how the rest of NATO feels about this sale.
Thank you. The lady back there.
I have 2 quick questions. One
Sorry,
is...
could you identify yourself?
Sure. My name is Ilhan Kagri. I work for the Muslim Public Affairs Council.
Thank you.
I just need some clarification in terms of, because you were speaking about whether this would be President Erdogan's first term or second term. And there's talk that, that in the passage of the referendum, part of it was that if the president dissolves parliament or renews parliament, that the term limit clock goes back to 0. So if you could please clarify that for me, and that's my first question. And the second question was with this, it seems like the AK Party and Erdogan in particular have very long-range views about bringing back Ottomanism. And so is there any sort of ideas, or do you see anything in terms of maybe at some point moving into Syria, taking over parts of Syria, sort of semi-autonomously, and then eventually absorbing that?
Okay. Another question here.
My name is Ahmed Hashemi. I'm unaffiliated. So my question is, considering the fact that Turkey is going through this process of Islamization since 1980s, and especially it is expedited after, like in 20s onward, the election of the Muharrem İnce and the CHP, their ascent to power as president, how will it change the dynamics and the society in Turkey, considering the fact that the Muharrem İnce and CHP is giving up, is compromising in many of their staunch secularist values?
Okay, well, you
to jump in?
Sure, maybe Levent Bey, did you hear the question about the two-term limit to the president? There was a question, what happens if the president dissolves the parliament? What happens to that term limit clause?
The constitution, Turkish constitution, was amended back in 2007, and the president, the next president, would be elected by direct popular vote. And that amendment also stipulated that one person can only be elected twice. So there is no talk of terms or other words are not applicable. The Constitution reads very clearly that one person can only be elected twice. So accordingly, Erdogan was elected in August 2014 for the first time. Now, if he is going to be elected for the second time in 24 June or July 8th, then he cannot be elected for a third time. That is the constitutional rule. And constitutions don't speak of systems. Who speaks of systems? Political scientists, constitutional interpreters, constitutional lawyers, constitutional scholars. We talk about presidential systems, parliamentary systems, a new form of government, etc. But constitutions have norms. And this 2007 amended norm is in force. And despite the fact that the AKP and Erdogan managed to get an amended constitution in 2007, they didn't change this rule that one person can only be elected twice. So that rule is still in force. So Erdogan cannot be elected for a third time if he dissolves the new parliament and calls for new elections. Okay. But if the parliament dissolves itself and also simultaneously the presidency, then Erdogan can run for the third time, because the Constitution says if the early election decision is made by the parliament before the end of the second term of the president, then he can run for the third time. Okay. That is the only that the Constitution talks about the presidential term. That is my opinion.
Thank you. Alan?
Sure. Look, as far as NATO and the S-400, they don't like it. Stoltenberg has spoken out and said that they're uncomfortable about the idea. So, look, by the way, in my last answer, I don't want to rule out that Erdogan has made some kind of decision about moving closer to Russia that will be long-lasting, but I do think the logic of it is that Turkey gets so much from its NATO membership in terms of know-how, prestige that resonates even in the Middle East, and they're allowed to pursue a fairly independent foreign policy and still stay in NATO. It seems to me logical that if the price of that is either mothballing the S-400, if some has suggested, or canceling the deal, logic would still suggest that'll be the way they go. But if they don't, then we know that he's made a very dramatic decision. Look, I just want to say one thing on the term limits. issue, I think one of the things that's confusing, there are two things that are confusing people about it. One is even members of the AK Party government are saying, well, if we lose, including Erdogan, if we lose parliament, we're going to go to new elections. They haven't absorbed their own system, it seems, because the rules are that the president and parliament are electorally joined at the hip. If there are parliamentary elections, there's got to be presidential elections, and the president's term ends. So the other thing that is, I think, confusing it is that Erdogan's people have indicated, and the opposition has not taken on the issue in the way Levent has here, has very logically taken it on here. Erdogan's folks have been saying that this is a new system, he gets 2 new terms. There's logically no reason why that should be the case. It's not a new constitution. It's not even a new title for the office. So it's not a new system, but I think that is confusing. But no, the clock, according to the rules, the clock should not be set back. If Muharrem İnce wins, look, I think, yes, you're going to see less emphasis on religion. You're going to see fewer Imam Hatib, fewer schools converted into Imam Hatibs, fewer Imam Hatibs built. I think you're going to see a restructuring of the education system, although I don't think it's going to be the current level of roughly 10% students being in Imam Hatib probably won't change, but there won't be a push to increase it. You're not going to see, you know, increased hours for religious instruction and in the public schools and things like that. Now, on the economy, they are pushing things like, you know, a dramatic increase in the minimum wage and other things which could be inflationary. So I don't know. I share Gonul's musing that they could come in and the economy could be set up to collapse, you know, and they could get the blame for it. I'm not expecting them to come in, but I think those are some of the ways that things could change.
Guney?
Quick answers to a few points about how other NATO partners see Turkey's S-400 purchase. I think the opinions about Turkey's value in NATO changed from the one side of the Atlantic to the other, because the United States doesn't need necessarily NATO for protection, but as much as against Russia, as much as European countries do. And so Turkey's membership in NATO is not necessarily discussed, let's say, in Europe. And Europe is very happy to see Turkey as a kind of a sentinel on the Russian border. But I think Turkish-Russian rapprochement hasn't yet created like a panic in Europe that this political rapprochement would mean Turkey cannot necessarily be counted on in case of a Russian aggression against Europe. So I don't think that discussion has been matured in Europe in that sense. On the election on more than 2 terms thing, President Erdogan was actually recently asked this question, whether he would seek another term after winning this election. He didn't rule out. He said, let's see what happens in this election, and we'll decide later. So he didn't necessarily. His idea might be different from our panelists here in that sense. About Ottomanism, the question, I think we can also point out that the idea of the idea of Ottomanism, and if that is the case in President Erdogan's mind, is a bit different from the actual Ottomanist expansion in the Middle East, because the expansion of Ottomans in the Middle East dependent a lot on kind of cooperation with the Kurds, for example, both in Syria and against Iran. And at the moment, the Turkish foreign policy is firmly anti-Kurdish, preferring Sunni Arabs over the Kurds, and trying not to alienate Iran when seeking a leadership role for Sunnis in the region. So it doesn't look very much like Ottomanism. And in practice, we see, for example, in northern Syria, northwestern Syria, where Turkey is kind of have proxies, Free Syrian Army troops. which are mostly, they are being kind of, the ideology that they have is an amalgam of Turkish nationalism and Islamism. And these people, most of them are Arab, including the Turkmen groups. The naming Turkmen groups, their membership are mostly Arab. So there's a bit of a confusion there. And this, Sunni Arab, Sunni sectarian and Turkish nationalist kind of ideology is not complemented with other foreign policy steps because Turkey is, there's also rapprochement between Turkey and Iran. So what kind of a Sunni sectarian regime or Sunni sectarian ideology that favors Sunni Arabs can side with Iran on many issues. So there are a lot of problematic issues when it comes to I don't think it can be described as Ottomanism. I think Turkish nationalism is the main issue in Turkish foreign policy at the moment.
Well, unfortunately, our time is up, but thank you so much, Levent Bey, Ellen, and Guney. This was a wonderful discussion, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.